So 11 years after that fateful day, how has the world changed? Joining me from Charlotte, North Carolina, is well-known author, activist, and investigative journalist Amy Goodman. She is the host of Democracy Now!, an independent news and political show that's broadcast on American radio, television, and it's also found on the internet. Welcome to the show, Amy. Let me start by asking you, where were you on 9/11?
I was broadcasting Democracy Now! We were just blocks from Ground Zero. We were the closest national broadcast to the Twin Towers. In fact, we were doing our broadcast at 9 o'clock that morning. At 8:47, the first plane hit the first tower of the World Trade Center. We didn't know what had happened. We were in the garret, the attic of this firehouse, and we were just preparing the broadcast. At 9:03, the next plane hit. We were on the air, and amazingly enough, we were doing a special already that day on the connection between terrorism and September 11th. That's September 11th, 1973, when the Pinochet forces rose to power in Chile, and they killed the democratically elected president. It led to his death, Salvador Allende. And we were talking about that connection when this, in fact, happened. We just kept on the air throughout the day. People were running down the road. They would come in. We would interview them. We were broadcasting out of a decommissioned firehouse. And so the folks were giving them water. They were getting access to phone to call their loved ones. It was a horrific moment. I stayed in the firehouse for the next 4 days because we were within the evacuation zone.
On 9/11, I was on my way into work, and I witnessed the jet going into the Pentagon, and I have similar recollections. I didn't want to leave the area. I didn't want to get past the yellow tape. And the one thing that really struck me on that day is that everything was erased, that all the divisions in this country were erased. Race didn't matter. There were no Republicans and Democrats, as you well recall. The members of the House and the Senate sat there on the Capitol steps and held hands and sang "God Bless America." Even Le Monde, the newspaper in France, said "We are all Americans" as a headline, screaming headline. How has the United States lost all that goodwill, would you say, and have they?
Well, you know, it was a horrifying moment, but it was also a time when people came together. In New York, thousands poured into parks, and they carried candles, and they comforted each other. They discussed, they questioned, they wept. And I felt that much of the media was broadcasting a kind of blood-curdling call for revenge, when that's not what people were talking about. As a group of dissident artists put up stickers all over, they said, "Our grief is not a cry for war." And that was very much the sentiment of people all over. And I think where the goodwill was squandered, where here the U.S. was this victim of this terrible attack, almost 3,000 people incinerated in a moment. And so what does the United States do? First declaring war on Afghanistan, and then building the case for attacking Iraq. If you ask most Americans at that time, even today, I don't think people would say that 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. They would think they were all Iraqi. Mm-hmm. Yet there was not that connection, and there weren't weapons of mass destruction, and the world saw that. And yet the U.S. forged forward, and that was the horror. That's what squandered the goodwill of people all over the world.
Well, 11 years after the attacks, the United States is still in Afghanistan. There's been drone attacks in Pakistan. How would you, I want to ask the question about Al-Qaeda and Taliban. Do you feel like they're broken now, or has this really kind of engendered a lot of ill will towards the United States that wasn't there on that day that we talked about?
Well, I don't think there could be a better way of recruiting for those organizations than the U.S.'s attack on Iraq and also in Afghanistan, devastating this country. It has been years. Afghanistan, it is the longest war in U.S. history. Now, you remember when Colin Powell gave his push for war at the UN on February 5th, 2003. Millions of people watched. as he made the final case for weapons of mass destruction. Of course, that did not turn out to be true. It was the final nail in the coffin for so many. Colin Powell, General Powell, who is the Secretary of State, now calls it a stain on his career. But the U.S., George W. Bush, Colin Powell, Condoleezza Rice, they made this case. The U.S., it was a pretext to attack this country. They wanted Saddam Hussein out, and instead what we have seen is untold numbers of deaths.